Okay, well, fifth graders, we're here looking at lesson 1.4. We're still in chapter 1, and today we're going to be starting to take a little look at fractions and decimals. Before we go into our lesson, though, I want you to pause, take a screenshot, do whatever you need to do of this little chart right here. This has to do with place values that involve decimals. Now, we talked about the ones place. The ones place is just to the left of the decimal point, so it's the last place right before the decimal point. And then after the decimal point, we first have the tenths, then the hundredths, and the thousandths. And you'll see how they all kind of end in that little THS. So it's tenths, hundredths, thousandths. And so that's what we're going to be referring to today. So if you haven't yet, make sure you write this down, freeze it, take a screenshot, do whatever you have to do. We'll be talking about that. Now, the first part of your assignment today, and I'm going to go ahead and get this turned here, talks about writing the decimal as a fraction. Okay, so our first one here says decimal point 823. Now, remember when we say things in word form, it's always something and then the decimal takes the place of the and then we say whatever that is. So we can pretend there's a 0 there. Let's go ahead and plug that in. That might make it a little easier to understand. So for this one, for number 1, I would actually say this as 0 and 823 thousandths, because remember on our place value chart, we have the tenths, then the hundredths, then the thousandths. So this would be 0 and 823 thousandths. Now I don't have to say the 0 and. I can just say 823 thousandths, and that is sufficient. So writing the decimal as a fraction, 823 thousandths. So remember, a fraction has a numerator and a denominator. This would make 823 at the top over 1,823 thousandths. So I go on to number 2, and I have 0 and 9 hundredths. Now the 9 is in the hundredths place. There's nothing in the tenths place. But after the decimal here with these numbers, I have to have something there. I can't just put nothing there. I can't just put 0.9. I can't skip a place value. So since that 9 is in the hundredths place, that 0 has to go there in the tenths place. So this is 0 and 9 hundredths. Or I can just say 9 hundredths. And that's okay too. So if I think about that as a fraction, 9 hundredths, that's going to be 9 as a numerator, and then 100 as a denominator. 9 hundredths. Last one in this section, we have 0.7, but I would actually say that as 0 and 7 tenths. 0 and 7 tenths, because remember, it's tenths, then hundredths, then thousandths. If I didn't want to say the 0 and, I could just say 7 tenths. And so thinking about that as a fraction, here in number 3, that would be 7 over 10, or 7 tenths. So that's the first section that you're going to have on your assignment. I'm not expecting a lot of difficulty there. Write the decimal as a fraction. Now the next one, we're doing just the opposite. So now we have the fraction, and we need to turn it into a decimal number. So the directions tell us to write the fraction as a decimal. Now, so these are all just fractions. They're not mixed numbers. So 5th grade, I want you to think of these when we say them as a decimal, they're going to be 0 and. 0 and. If I had a number here like 1 or 2, then I know it would be something and some bigger number than 0. But there's no number, they're just fractions. So everything here is going to be 0 and, just like what we did here. Now, so here I have 73 over 100. So I could think of that as 73 hundredths, or 0 and 73 hundredths. So I'm going to think, well, that would be 0 and in place of the and, you put the decimal. 73 hundredths. Now remember, my place value chart is tenths, then hundredths, then thousandths. And since this is 73 hundredths, my 3 has to go in the hundredths place, which means my 7 is going to have to go here in the tenths place. So it's going to be 0.73. Now if I don't put the 0 and I just want to put 0.73, that's okay. That won't be a problem. All right, so now I have 95 over 1,000 for number 2, or 95 thousandths, or 0 and 95 thousandths. Now if I refer back to my place value chart, if this is 95 thousandths, my 5 has to go in the thousandths place. And if my 5 is going to go in the thousandths place, then since it's 95 thousandths, my 9 has to go in the hundredths place. But I have to put a number in the tenths place because it's just 95 thousandths. Since there's no number to go there, I have to put a 0 here. So it's going to be 0.095. And so I'm looking at that, 0 and 95 thousandths, 0.095. Last one in this section, 6 tenths. 6 over 10 is 6 tenths. Okay, so once again, it's 0 and 6 tenths. So 0 and, okay? And since it's 6 tenths, and if I look back at this one more time, since it's the tenths that comes right after the decimal and it's 6 tenths, my 6 needs to go here. So that makes it pretty straightforward. I'm just going to have 0.6, or if I don't want to put the 0, I can just put 0.6. Just like here in number 2, if I just wanted to put 95 thousandths, that would be okay. All right, now earlier in this chapter, we talked about 10 times as great and 1/10 of. And so we have a couple questions here to finish this out. Now, when we say these decimal numbers, 5th grade, we're really going to practice saying them right. So I want to say them right on the video. I'm going to want you to say them right in class. And when you're practicing, if you're doing assignments with your parents, doing something with a classmate, whatever, when you're responding in class, we're going to want you to say them right. So we're going to call this 0 and 7 hundredths. Since that 7 is in the hundredths place, we're not going to say 0.07. We're going to say 0 and 7 hundredths. So this says 0 and 7 hundredths is 10 times as great as what number? So 0 and 7 hundredths is 10 times as great as what number? Now 10 times as great means that this is the bigger number. This is 10 times as great, so this is the bigger number, which means I'm comparing it to a smaller number. So if I'm going to have this number is my biggest number, and I need to figure out the smaller number, I'm going to be dividing. So it's essentially going to be 0 and 7 hundredths divided by 10. So, well, what does that mean? How do I divide this by 10? Well, essentially when I divide by 10, or if I divide by 100, or if I divide by 1,000, all I'm doing is moving the decimal. Okay, I don't really have to think about the division too much. All I'm doing is moving the decimal. So when I divide by 10, there's 1 0 in 10. So I'm going to move my decimal just one place. Now since I'm dividing, I'm going to move it to the left. When I divide, the decimal moves to the left. When I multiply, the decimal moves to the right. And we'll talk about that here in a minute. But since I'm moving the decimal one place to the left, I can take this decimal and I'm just going to move it one place to the left. And so now my decimal is here. So I'm going to end up with decimal 007, which is the answer that I want. And then I want to think, well, what is this number? Well, it's 0 and I don't need the 0 here, but I can put it if I like it. Some of you may feel more comfortable doing that. Some of you may not need to. Okay? I am always a big proponent of The less you can write, the better, because sometimes the more we write with these extra digits, the more likely we're going to make a mistake. So if you don't need to put this 0, I would propose that you don't. But it's not wrong to put it, and it's okay if you do put it. So anyway, we have 0 and 7. But what place is this 7 in? Well, let's remember our places. Tenths, hundredths, thousandths. So I call this number 7 thousandths, or 0 and 7 thousandths. Either one is okay. All right, last one for this video today, 0.003. Well, of course, you're probably thinking, well, Mr. Swack, you can't say numbers like that. Well, you're right. So we want to make sure we know how to say this number. 0 and 3. Well, what place is this 3 in? Well, once again, tenths, hundredths, thousandths. So this is 0 and 3 thousandths, or just 3 thousandths. Is 1/10 of what number? Well, remember earlier in chapter 1, when we talk about 1/10 of, okay, this is going to be the smaller number. We're comparing it to a bigger number, and this is just 1/10 of. So since we want to find a bigger number, we're now going to multiply by 10, since it's 1/10 of. So essentially what I'm doing is I'm doing 0 and 3 thousandths times 10. And since I'm multiplying, I'm going to move the decimal to the right. Remember, when I multiply by 10, 100,000, 10,000, and so forth, all I'm doing is moving the decimal. What's important is to keep track of how many times we move the decimal. Well, in 10, there's just 1 0 in 10. So I'm going to move it one place. So when we're multiplying, we move our decimal to the right. So this decimal is going to move one place to the right, which means now it's between those two zeros, which means that I end up with 0.03. Okay, technically I have another 0 there, but there's no reason for 2 zeros here. And technically, if I want to, I can just put 0.03. But we don't say that 0.03. We would say this is 0 and 3. Well, 3 what? Tenths, hundredths. 3 thousandths is 1/10 of 3 hundredths, or 0 and 3 hundredths. Down here, just 3 hundredths. All right, we'll be going over this a little bit more in class. All right, talk to you later, 5th grade. Bye.